a Sunday afternoon wedding, which is very nice. The following weekend is Thanksgiving weekend, so we'll have no lecture then. And then the weekend after that is December, and we're in our December Christmas break. So, this is the very casual church for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We take every opportunity to take a break. We're getting into the spirit of the age. We're training to be government employees. In any event, so this is it until January. So if I don't see some of you until January, have a good Thanksgiving and Christmas. And the Lord willing, we'll see you in January. All right, with those introductory remarks out of the way, let's begin. We're examining the books of history. And the book of Joshua tells us about the conquest of Canaan. The books of Judges and Ruth tell us about the 350 years Israel's ruled by judges. The book of 1 Samuel tells us about the reign of King Saul. The book of 2 Samuel tells us about the reign of King David. 2 Samuel ended with David's last great sin, the sin of taking a census. The book that follows is 1 Kings. It starts with the death of David, and then proceeds to tell us about the reign of King Solomon. And then when King Solomon died in 931, his son Rehoboam ascended the throne. The people of Israel came to Rehoboam and asked him to lighten up. His father had been manic in building projects everywhere, for which he conscripted people into forced labor and taxed them heavily. So they said, lighten up. Rehoboam consulted some of his friends who said, ignore them. Tell them that you're going to be even harsher than your father, which he did, at which time the 10 northern tribes said, drop dead to Rehoboam, we'll form our own nation. And they did. They formed what's called the northern kingdom, and they made Jeroboam their king. And these really were two separate nations. It wasn't just a fictitious separation, it was very real. Sometimes they would go to war against each other. So two separate nations. The northern kingdom had 19 kings, 9 dynasties. It was especially wicked. And after 200 years, God ended it with the Assyrian captivity. The southern kingdom, with Rehoboam as its king, also had 19 kings, but only one dynasty, because God had promised that David's throne was an eternal throne. There would be only one dynasty. The southern kingdom had a few righteous kings, which meant that it was a little less wicked, as intensely wicked as the north. It lasted about 350 years, but then the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom and destroyed it and took the entire population back to Babylon. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings tell us about the reign of Solomon and the time of the divided kingdom. The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles give us the same history from a more religious point of view. Now, thus far, in our study of these two groups of books, there are a number of events that are important. We could talk about lots and lots of different events, but we're going to focus on the reign of Solomon, which we've already examined, and then the foolish reign of his son, a reign that didn't last very long for a joint kingdom. And now, after talking about Rehoboam, which we talked about last week, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Jeroboam, the first king in the north. Jeroboam had a problem. He had a kingdom in which the religious center was in another nation. And that is a real problem. There are a number of things that hold a people together. A common land, a common culture, a common language, but also a common religion. And while it's true that the men and women of Israel, like most of the men, or essentially all of the people in the Middle East, were polytheistic, they never stopped worshiping Jehovah. He was their special God. And the problem Rehoboam faced was the center for Jehovah worship was in Jerusalem, which was in another nation. So he looked at that situation and says, the people are going to be going down to Jerusalem to worship Jehovah. Now, I know you're going to be reading through the books of Kings and Chronicles and saying, yeah, but they're also idolatrous and worshiping other gods. This is true, but they never gave up worshiping Jehovah. All these nations were polytheistic, but they all had their own particular special God. And Israel always recognized that Jehovah was their special God. Jehovah was the God that delivered them from bondage in Egypt, took care of them in the wilderness, and delivered them into the land of Canaan. So they still wanted to worship him as their special God. And Jeroboam thought, they're going to go down to Jerusalem. They're going to start worshiping Jehovah there, which was normal. And pretty soon their allegiance is going to shift from me to the southern kingdom. And I'm going to lose them. So what I need to do is figure out a way for them to worship Jehovah in the north. And that's where the golden calves came in at Dan and Bethel. So let's work our way through this. Let's go to the PowerPoint. The problem of Israelites going to Jerusalem was a big problem. The center of Israel's religious life was in Jerusalem and another nation. He knew that religion is a force that holds people together. His subjects, he thought, will go to Jerusalem to worship and change their allegiance. And we read about this in 1 Kings 12. What I try to do as I work our way through is give you some explanation, some of great passages of Scripture, but give you some of it because you need to hear from the Lord. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go, to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. His solution was to set up golden calves at Dan in the north, which is the extreme north, and Bethel in the south, which was in the extreme southern end of the northern kingdom. Now, to the casual reader who's going through the books of Kings and Chronicles, he would read this and think, well, he's just introducing another god to them. That wasn't the case. Golden calf worship was an alternate way to worship Jehovah. It was a heretical form of Jehovah worship. It was an idolatrous form of Jehovah worship. He wasn't introducing a new God. He was saying, worship God at the golden calves. And the reason for that was this. In the Middle East, people believed that their gods were invisible and that they stood above golden calves or were enthroned above golden calves to receive worship. So when he put up the golden calves, he was just saying, this is just a culturally acceptable way to worship Jehovah. Now, Jehovah didn't buy this package. In fact, he'd warned them not to do things like that. But Jeroboam said, no, this is how we're going to worship Jehovah. And the truth is the people bought into the idea because the culture in which they lived bought into that idea. So it was really very easy for him to convince them to worship Jehovah at Dan and Bethel because the culture accepted that as a means of worshiping whatever God you wanted to worship. Now, the lesson we need to learn here is don't let your culture decide how you worship God. We do it all the time, and it's a major problem. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but it's one of the major threats to genuine, biblical, doctrinally sound Christianity. We allow our culture to come in and determine how we worship. In fact, lots of people come into the Church of Jesus Christ with a cultural view of God, not a biblical view of God. They think they know about God because culture teaches them about God, but the God the culture teaches them about is not the God of the Bible. So that was a major problem. His solution was to set up golden calves at Dan and Bethel. This was an alternate form of Jehovah worship. Golden calves, as we pointed out, were an idolatrous form of Jehovah worship. The cultural belief that gods stood above golden calves to receive worship. One of the world's premier Middle Eastern archaeologists, W.F. Albright, wrote this. The Canaanite deities, or gods, were nearly always represented as standing on the back of animals or on a throne borne by animals, but never as the animals themselves. So this is from an archaeologist helping to validate what I've just said. Now, the problem you have with that is that if you went to someone and said, you're worshiping a golden calf, they would say, no, I'm worshiping the God who's enthroned above the golden calf. But in time, if you keep falling down before the golden calf, the God you're worshiping becomes one with the golden calf. The reason I point that out, because you could ask the same question of someone who worships a statue of Jesus. Ask that other person if you're worshiping the idol, the statue of Jesus. They would say, oh, of course not. I'm worshiping the Jesus that stands behind the statue. But in time, all they see is the what? They see the statue. And it's an idolatrous form of worshiping the Lord. And he doesn't like it. Aaron did much the same thing at Mount Sinai. We talked about this several months ago. The Israelites, remember when Moses went up on the mountain and he didn't come down for a while, and the Israelites said, make us gods. And so he asked for their jewelry. He made a golden calf. And then it's very interesting what he said to the children of Israel. He built an altar in front of the calf and announced, tomorrow there will be a festival to whom? To the Lord, Jehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When it's all caps like that, it's a translation of Jehovah. And this is the personal name of God. It never speaks of an idolatrous God. So tomorrow we're going to worship Jehovah at the golden calves. What did God think about that? Did not like that. So this whole idea of the golden calf worship was not new to Israel. They had the same problem in the wilderness. God prohibited this. In Exodus 20, God said, you shall not make for yourselves an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth below, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or to worship them. Worshiping the golden calf was breaking the second commandment, not the first commandment. The first commandment is, have no other gods. I am Jehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Sometimes when I pray, I want to make sure that whoever's listening to my prayers in the spiritual world knows I'm talking about that particular God, Jehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, God is saying in these commandments, the first thing you have to deal with is you need to dismiss all the false gods and worship me. That's step one, commandment number one. Step two, now that you've decided to worship me, Jehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, don't distort me. I will tell you who I am. Don't distort me. Don't make an idol of me, as you do in the golden calf. Don't make a statue of me and fall down before it. And don't cherry pick what you liked about me in the Bible and what you disliked, because if you end up doing that, you end up creating a distortion. I am who I am. Let God define himself. And this is what I was getting at a moment ago. This is one of the major problems in Christendom. I listen to some people, even in evangelical churches, talk about the God of the Bible. I don't recognize him. I recognize in pieces of him, but you can't just sort of pick what you like and dismiss what you dislike. Oh, God is too loving to send anyone to hell. Well, which God is that? That's not the God of the Bible. You know what people will go through and they'll say they like his love. I like his love too. I like his mercy. I really like his mercy. His grace. But they don't want to talk about his holiness and his righteousness and his wrath and his judgment. No, they sort of dismiss that. Now, when people do that, what have they done? They've created an idolatrous form of the true God. They're breaking not the first commandment, they're breaking the second commandment. They're all proud of themselves because they're not breaking the first. Good, I'm glad. Step one is hang in with number one. But after that, you've got to embrace the God of the Bible, and he defines himself. And what they were doing here is they were breaking the second commandment, and God prohibited that as well. People break the second commandment in a variety of ways, by bowing down to images, and as I've just pointed out, by distorting the God of Scriptures, cherry-picking the characteristics you like. I've noticed people who are pacifists choose to make God a pacifist. People who tend to be non-confrontational think that God would never be confrontational. There are other folks who are more militant. They make God a militant. Stop it. Accept him as he is. So you distort the God of the Scriptures by cherry-picking characteristics that you like and dismissing the others. When we do that, we create an idolatrous form of Jehovah worship. We create a heretical form. And that, in fact, to a large extent, is what Jeroboam was doing. He is forever known as the man who caused Israel to sin. As you read through the books of Kings and Chronicles, every so often they'll be talking about a king being wicked, king being wicked, king being wicked, and they'll refer him to Jeroboam as the man who caused Israel to sin. For 200 years, he was referred to as the man who caused Israel to sin. Why? Because he put up golden calves at Dan and Bethel, not to worship another god, but to create a heretical form of Jehovah worship. God decreed, it was so angry with Jeroboam for doing this, he decreed that his family would be wiped out. And within 23 years, a man named Baasha came along and killed every member of Jeroboam's family. Baasha then took the throne for himself. God was very unhappy with Jeroboam. And he says, because of what you've done, your entire family will be wiped out. And Baasha is a man who came in, killed Jeroboam's son, took over the throne for himself, and it was customary in the Middle East, not just during the times of antiquity, but even the Middle Ages. If you want to usurp another man's position on the throne, you better wipe out his family, all the pretenders to the throne. So it was very common if some man came in and killed a sitting king, to also kill all the members of his family, so there would be no heir to the throne that would contest his position on the throne. We read about it in 1 Kings 15. As soon as Baasha began to reign, he killed Jeroboam's whole family. He did not leave Jeroboam anyone that breathed, but destroyed them all, according to the word of the Lord given through his servant Ahijah the Shilonite, because of the sins Jeroboam had committed and caused Israel to commit, and because he provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger. So, we have thus far examined the reign of King Solomon in our study of Kings and Chronicles, the foolish reign of Rehoboam, Jeroboam introducing the golden calves, and now we're going to start talking about the dark days of King Ahab and Jezebel. They were two kings in the north. We're going to be focusing on the north for a little while. 60 years passed from the time of the divided kingdom when Rehoboam blew it and Jeroboam took over the north, and the reign of Ahab. And things were bad during those years. Those were, in fact, the first 60 years in the history of the northern kingdom were dark. The nation's spiritual life was dark, thanks to Jeroboam introducing golden calves. And the nation's political life was dark. During that first 60 years, 7 kings ruled in the north. All of them were wicked, and there were 4 dynasties. And 2 of those families were completely destroyed. So you're talking about a spiritual chaos and political chaos. Now, we're not going to slug through all these kings in the north and the south, but I want to just give you a brief overview of these 7 kings, just to give you a sense of the darkness that was taking place in the political life of the north. Jeroboam is number 1. He was the first king in the north. He ascended to the throne. He ruled for 21 years. Apparently, he died of natural causes. His son Nadab ascended the throne and ruled for 2 years. He was then killed by a man named Baasha. Baasha ascended the throne. He ruled for 23 years, and the first thing he did was kill not only Nadab, but Jeroboam's whole family, so there would be no pretender to the throne. You understand their point? It's not just cruel, it was a political necessity. And whatever politicians will do that is necessary, they will do to maintain their positions of power. That's the nature of the beast. And he apparently died of natural causes. He was number 3. His son Elah ascended the throne, ruled for 2 years, and he was killed by a man named Zimri, who was his chariot commander. And Zimri ascended the throne. He only ruled 7 days. But he had ruled long enough to kill Elah and his family. The army didn't like Zimri, didn't want him to be king, so they laid a siege around his city of Tisra. Zimri realized the hopelessness of his situation, set his house on fire, burned himself to death, and the army made a man named Omri king. Omri ascended the throne and ruled for 12 years. Apparently he died of natural causes. And when he died, his son Ahab ascended the throne and ruled for 22 years. Now, from Jeroboam to Ahab, 60 years. You got 7 kings and 4 dynasties and 2 families completely wiped out. Now, they go worship at the golden calves. When you choose to rebel against God, madness reigns, evil reigns, wickedness reigns. I wish everybody would get this idea straight. You know, I don't care who we put out in Washington, if we as a nation turn our backs on God, we're in trouble. I don't care if there's a Republican there or a Democrat there. There's a lot of reasons to vote for the Republicans, mainly because of their position on abortion. I understand that. But it's not enough to please God. Keep in mind, when Jeroboam set up the golden calves, he wasn't saying, oh, come worship Baal, come worship Moloch. He was saying, come worship Jehovah. Just do it in a heretical way. Because he didn't call it heretical, but People went along with it. And look at what happened as a result. In 60 years, 7 kings, 4 dynasties, and 2 families completely wiped out. Chaos is reigning. And things were bad to the time of Ahab. Folks, they're going to get worse. Because Ahab married a woman named Jezebel. Jezebel was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Tyre and Sidon. And Jezebel loved Baal. I wish the Israelites loved, every time I read about Jezebel, all I can think of is, I wish the Israelites had that much passion for Jehovah. She was in love with him. And she wasn't willing to settle on just the Israelites worshiping Baal along with everything else. No. It was going to be Baal and Baal alone. Just like God says, I'm exclusive, worship me and me alone. She said, no, I don't want Israelites to share their worship with anybody other than Baal. So she set out to not only promote Baal worship, but to wipe Jehovah worship off the face of the northern kingdom. She had the army chase down God's prophets and kill them. So he married Jezebel, very wicked woman. He, together with her, promoted Baal worship. And God raised up a man to challenge him. His man's name was Elijah. And later on, Ahab died in a battle when a soldier randomly shot an arrow. We'll talk more about that later, but I'm just trying to give you a little sense of what happened to Ahab. Not good. But unfortunately, he caused a lot of damage before he left. He had 22 years to promote Baal. Now, the first 60 years in the history of the northern kingdom were obviously dark. We just examined examined those 7 kings, and we saw how dark indeed it was. The days grew darker with Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel wanted Baal worship to replace golden calf worship. Jezebel wanted Baal to be the official god of Israel, and Jezebel wanted Jehovah removed completely from Israel. Oh, this is not all. Well, I'm sorry. A piece of my scriptures didn't get on this. Sometimes these new contraptions leave me. Okay, anyway, when Ahab became king of Israel and he reigned, it was talking about Ahab, he reigned in Samaria over Israel for 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, that is the sins of golden calf worship, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Samaria was a city right here. It's about halfway between the northern end of the Dead Sea and the southern end of the Sea of Galilee. This is about 65 miles. Samaria is about halfway up, and that was the capital of the northern kingdom. Jerusalem was the capital of the southern kingdom, Samaria the capital of the northern kingdom. He set up an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him. Now, when you read about Asherah and Baal, these usually went together. Baal, I'll bring in a picture after the first of the year of Baal, a scrawny little guy who looks ugly as sin. And they would put altars before him, and then they would have a pole called an Asherah pole. That symbolized his female consort. Now, sometimes the female consort, the Asherah, was his wife, sometimes his mistress, sometimes his mother, sometimes something else. You got to keep in mind that there was no standard book on idolatry in the Middle East. So everybody sort of did what they wanted to. Unfortunately, what we've been doing with Christianity for the last 2,000 years. So we laugh at them, but we do the same thing. All right. The first 60 years were dark. I've just given you a brief overview of the northern kingdom, of the 7 kings there, to show you how dark it was. And it even grew darker with Ahab and Jezebel. God raised up Elijah to battle this great evil. God raised up one of the most remarkable men in history. And we'll talk just a few minutes about Elijah. Elijah is the man God raised up to counter the great sins of Ahab and Jezebel. They've come in after 60 years. He's going to rule for 22. They want to wipe out all vestiges of Jehovah in the northern kingdom. God is going to challenge that. And to challenge that, he raises up this incredible man named Jeremiah. Not Jeremiah. Elijah. Elijah comes roaring into the story of the northern kingdom very abruptly. In the 17th chapter of 1 Kings, he just comes roaring in. We don't know anything about his parents. We don't know anything about his childhood. We don't know about his call to ministry. It's just suddenly, we're reading the 16th chapter of 1 Kings. Things are going bad with Jezebel wiping out all the prophets of God. And suddenly, this guy named Elijah comes roaring in from the desert. And he confronts Ahab. He tells Ahab he tells Ahab and Israel that he's going to usher in a drought. And in doing so, he was challenging Baal to a duel with Jehovah. Now, let me explain what that means. So you've got Ahab and Jezebel doing their thing. They're trying to wipe out all vestiges of Jehovah worship, even heretical forms of Jehovah worship. So God raises up Elijah. Elijah comes in and says, Ahab, I'm going to call a drought on the northern kingdom. And we know in James it was a 3.5-year drought. That was a challenge to Baal. And the reason that was a challenge to Baal was because Baal was the god of rain or storms and agriculture. Jehovah was considered the god of the deserts. Now, what I'm talking about now is not the biblical view, it's the cultural view. The children of Israel viewed their special God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God Jehovah, as really existing and the one who delivered them from Egypt and had taken care of them in the desert. But now that they were in the land of Canaan, they needed someone to give them rain and to help them grow their crops and provide the grass for their herds. And Baal, according to the culture of the day, was the god of rain and the god of agriculture. So the children of Israel say, Jehovah, we like you. You did a really good thing for us out there in the desert, and we appreciate you getting us out of Egypt. And when we get in a real jam, we're going to call on you. But you know what? We've got children to feed. We've got herds that need grass. We need water. And the folks in Canaan say that Baal is the god to go to for that. We know that you're powerful, but when it comes to rain and agriculture, Baal is more powerful. Into that situation comes this guy named Elijah and says, I represent Jehovah. And guess what he's going to do? He's going to shut up the sky for the next 3.5 years. That was a duel. This is a contest. We're going to go to war. The children of Israel are going to have to decide which God they're going to serve. They think that they haven't rejected Jehovah, but what they're doing is they're spending part of their worship time with Baal because they think Baal is going to give them the rain they need and the crops they need. So let's have a contest. Now, we all know about the contest that took place at top Mount Carmel when Elijah built the altar and the priests of Baal built the altar and they all called down fire and that business. But what you sometimes fail to realize is the contest between Baal and Jehovah began 3.5 years earlier. It began with a battle of water. Baal, let's see how well you do. You are superior when it comes to water and agriculture, so let's see how you do against the inferior Jehovah. He was challenging him to a duel. We read about this, and this is our first reading. This is our first introduction to Elijah. 1 Kings 17. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, he just comes roaring in. We don't know anything about him prior to this time. We'll learn more about him as we work our way through this wonderful book. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. James gives us a little bit more information. Sometimes you got to go to the New Testament to get the whole picture. Elijah was a man just like us. Well, not quite. I wish we all had the boldness he has. But what he's saying is he's a frail man like we are frail like him. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. Elijah is one of the most colorful characters in the Bible. He is, writers love describing him, and they sort of have a race to see who can describe him the best. I just wrote down a few of the descriptions from different commentaries about Elijah. He has been called the rough-hewn desert nomad, a burning, blazing, fearless firebrand, that's my favorite, a fierce desert fox, a man of fire, a solitary soul, an untutored child of the desert, and kind of an interesting, a Christian Rambo. And there are lots more. And all of them are accurate. This really describes the guy. Now, Elijah was also a man of great courage. A drought in an agrarian society was a death sentence for the people. He loved Israel. Now, he's going to challenge their idolatry. He's going to challenge their worship of Baal. He is going to be an instrument of God to punish them for their idolatry and their sin, their wickedness. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love the people. He loves them. And to pray for a drought and be used as an instrument to initiate this contest between Baal and Jehovah, he knew would be a contest that would lead to thousands dying of thirst and starvation. And so it takes courage to step out and do something like that. And also, he knew that he would be hated. They would try to kill him. In fact, a number of years, for several years during this drought, Ahab had a whole army looking for him. I mean, you know, that sounds a little paranoid, but it wasn't. It's sort of like King Saul and David. King Saul, if you remember, had a whole army out chasing down David. Well, King Ahab, a whole army. It's one thing to have a couple of guys angry with me. To have a whole army trying to find me and kill me, that's something else. So he knew he'd be hated. He knew that they'd try to kill him. He was grieved because he loved these people greatly. Elijah was, however, obedient to God's command to be a divine instrument of punishment. Elijah was also not only a man of great courage, he was a man of great patience. God sent, after Elijah confronted Ahab, God sent him to this brook called Cherith. The brook Cherith. It's a little brook on the eastern side of the Jordan River, about 40 miles north of Jerusalem. So God sent him there. He hung out at the brook Cherith, where he drank the water. God kept the water going there for about a year and had ravens feed him. We'll talk more about that later. And then after the brook ran dry, God sent Elijah north to a place called Zarephath, a little city called Zarephath. It was between Tyre and Sidon in the land of Phoenicia. And he stayed there for 2.5 years, living with a widow and her son. And then at the end of a total of 3.5 years, he came down to Mount Carmel, where he had the showdown with the prophets of Baal. And we all remember that story. The prophets of Baal built an altar and put a sacrifice on it. And Elijah built an altar and put a sacrifice on it. And the contest was the group of people who are worshiping the true and living God let fire come down from that God and burn up the sacrifice. The prophets of Baal danced around for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 hours, I've forgotten what. And nothing happened. And they tried to appeal to their gods by slashing themselves and doing a lot of really gross things. Elijah, when it came his time, he built the altar, put his sacrifice on the altar, dumped water on it to demonstrate that he wasn't doing there was no fakery here, because there was a lot of fakery and stuff back then. And he prayed to God. Fire came down, burned up the sacrifice, burned up the stones, licked up the water. And then Elijah now the people are on his side. He's looking good. Took the priests of priests of Baal and down to the Kishon River, which was at the foot of Mount Carmel, had them all killed. And then he tied up his robe around him because he said, hey, you know what? He saw a little cloud out here over the Mediterranean. So he said to Ahab, you better get back to Jezreel. Jezreel was his summer palace. Samaria was their capital. Jezreel was a summer palace. And he sort of girded up his loins and ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way from Mount Carmel to Jezreel. A really dynamite guy. I mean, this is This is a man of real passion. So, Elijah was a man of great patience. Courage, he was a man of great patience. He had to wait 3.5 years for this battle to play itself out. I mean, he's the sort of guy who'd been much happier being on the battlefield leading an army against the bad guys. Instead, he had to hang out at the brook Kerith for 1 year, or roughly 1 year, which was about as exciting as watching the Weather Channel. And then he had to go to Zarephath for 2.5 years. So he was a man of great patience. While this great battle between Baal, the god of rain and agriculture, played out and did battle with Jehovah, the God of the desert. He was also a man of great passion. As just pointed out, he put together a dramatic contest between Jehovah and Baal. He had the 450 prophets of Baal killed, and he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot from Carmel to Jezreel. He was a man of great passion, not only in his actions, but in his love for the Lord. He loved the Lord passionately. It just sort of comes springing off the pages of Kings. This guy loved God. That's all he wanted to talk about. That's all he wanted to live for. In the desert, the house, you don't know about family, home, businesses, nothing. All he cared about was God and the kingdom of God. Man of great passion. He passionately loved God. He passionately loved Israel. He passionately hated sin. And he passionately threw himself into God's work. This is the key to great men and women of God. They are passionate about serving the Lord, and they throw themselves into it. And we'll end on this. Great men and women of God don't have a bureaucratic mentality, which is to do as little as possible. You say, no, great servants of God aren't like that. Yes, they are. I know one guy, pastor at a church. I was part of it. I'm not a denominational guy, but for 7 years, I was part of the American Baptist Church. I pastored a little church in New Jersey. And there was one guy who was hanging in. He was just waiting for his retirement. He's saying, no, he must be rare. No, it happens a lot. He's a bureaucrat. Great men and women of God give their all. This is a great example, is in Elijah. They throw themselves completely into the service to the king and the kingdom. And that's one of the great lessons you learn as you look at the life of Elijah. I think he's a model, to be honest with you. I think he's a model. Here's a man who saw Jehovah as the creator God of the universe, and using Paul's imagery from the 12th chapter of Romans, let you offer your bodies living sacrifices. Here's a guy who metaphorically built an altar, laid himself out on the altar, and burned himself up for Jehovah. And that's how everyone ought to serve. And when there are Christian workers who aren't willing to do that, I'd say let's set them aside and put somebody else up there. And if you want a great example of a man who did that, you're going to find it in Elijah. Yes, he had some bad moments, but his moments weren't because of anything other than he thought that God was going to turn Israel around in his lifetime, and God didn't, and that depressed him. It wasn't because his health was bad or his bank account was low or people were angry with him and threatening his life. He didn't care about any of that. All he cared about, his only depression came out of he thought that Israel would repent, and it didn't. But we have a lot more to say about that. Because I think the truth is that God, see, he went through all this, and I think God let him believe that he was going to be an instrument to turn Israel back to God. No sacrifice was too great for that to be accomplished. Israel will be turned back to God. They're worshiping Baal, they're worshiping the golden calves, and God says, I'm going to use you as an instrument to turn Israel around. He couldn't sacrifice too much, anything. I'll live in the desert, I'll eat scorpions, whatever you want. But it didn't happen. And that was his only bad moment. That's when he went into depression and said, I'd just as soon die. You say, well, why would God let him down? Well, I don't think God did. Well, God never would. I think he just got the timing wrong by about 2,500 years. To begin with, about 800 years later, 900 years later, there was an Elijah-like character named John the Baptist who did turn some of the Israelites back to Jehovah. And then if you move forward in time to the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, there are going to be two incredible prophets. One of them is going to cause a worldwide drought for 3.5 years. And during that 3.5 years, Israel is going to come back to God. Many people believe that's going to be the Elijah that went to heaven without dying is going to come back and be one of those two witnesses. You read about them in the book of Revelation. And if you read about them there in Revelation chapter 11, you're going to find these two very special witnesses are going to be instrumental in turning Israel back to God. And one of the things, and they're going to be able to call fire down, and a 3.5 year drought. And many people think it's Elijah, or certainly an Elijah-like character. So when God let Elijah believe that he was going to be an instrument to turn Israel on, he was excited. I'll go anywhere. I'll do anything. I'll live in the desert. I'll sleep in sand. I don't care. It didn't happen. But God said, well, you just sort of missed it by 2,500 years, 3,000 years. God wouldn't let him down. He just missed it a little bit. But we'll talk more about that. That'll be an exciting time. That'll be an exciting time. It's coming soon, too, Lord willing. Let's pray. Father, we love you. We worship you. We thank you for being our God. I thank you for men like Elijah. They inspire me. They thrill me. They excite me. It's wonderful to read about and know about people who are completely sold out to you. I can't think of a better way to live. I know that's the way my brothers and sisters, many of my brothers and sisters in this room feel as well. You're altogether worthy of our complete allegiance, our complete devotion. You're altogether worthy, and we thank you for being a worthy one. I pray that you give my brothers and sisters a good Thanksgiving and Christmas. Bring us back safely next year to learn more about you. In Jesus' name we pray.